In December of the year 755, a powerful military general, An Lushan, turned his armies against the Tang Dynasty court and marched on the capital. This was the beginning of the An Lushan Rebellion, a period of chaos that lasted 8 years. By the end of it, some reports claim that the Tang Dynasty had lost an estimated 36 million people to war, famine, and ruin. The Tang Dynasty technically survived, but it was never the same again. Hey everyone, I'm Amy. Du Fu, one of the most famous poets of Chinese history, lived through the devastation of the An Lushan Rebellion, and he recorded what he saw and experienced in dozens of poems. Du Fu was captured by rebel forces, trapped in the fallen capital, and wandered the broken empire during the years of the rebellion. And what he wrote would become recognized by later historians as a record of history through poetry. The official histories usually recorded the emperors and the heroes, but Du Fu recorded the people. Today I will tell you a story of the An Lushan Rebellion through the eyes of Du Fu, a story reconstructed through his poems. The year was 755. Du Fu was in his 40s, and his life had not gone the way he planned. He grew up believing he was meant to serve the empire, that he was going to make a difference. He had spent nearly 10 years in the capital Chang'an trying to build a career in government service, and he finally had a post. But it was a minor one, 8th rank, overseeing military equipment. It paid so little that his family could not live with him in the capital and had to live in Fengxian instead, north of the city. In November, as winter was coming, Du Fu left the capital to visit his family. He set out in the middle of the night. It was cold. The frost had stiffened and broken the ties on his clothing, and his fingers were too numb to knot them again. Before dawn, he passed by Lishan Mountain, and there, on the mountainside, there were lights and warmth and noise. Emperor Shenzong was there with his favorite noble consort Yang at Huaqing Palace. He could see the steam from the hot springs, imperial guards moving through the mist, music so loud that it shook the mountain. Inside, the emperor and his officials were feasting, wrapped in fur and silk. Du Fu stood outside in the cold, and he thought about where that silk came from. Poor women weaving through the night. Their households were beaten and taxed until there was nothing left to take. And he thought to himself, behind the vermilion gates, wine and meat go to waste. But on the road lie the frozen bones of the poor, 2 worlds separated by a single gate. He turned away and continued north. At the Jing and Wei rivers, massive slabs of ice crashed through the water. The bridge was barely standing, and the supports creaked and groaned as he crossed. He made it over and kept walking. When he finally reached home, he heard it before he reached the door. Crying, the sound of grief. His youngest son had died, not from illness, but from hunger. The neighbors were weeping in the street, and he stood there, unable to move. He felt ashamed. He was a father who could not feed his own son in a year when the harvest was not even poor. He was a government official. He was exempt from military service and even spared from the worst taxes. But his son still starved. If this was his life, what was everyone else's life like? The farmers who had no exemptions, the men who were conscripted to the frontier, the families who produced the silk and grain that go behind those vermilion gates. His grief was heavy. It felt like the weight of the entirety of the Zhongnan Mountains, and it was overwhelming. Du Fu did not stay long in Fengxian. Just a few weeks after he arrived home to find his son dead, the military general An Lushan raised his banner and rebelled against the Tang Dynasty. By the summer of 756, An Lushan's forces had taken Tongguan Pass, and the rebellion had a clear path to Chang'an. Du Fu gathered his wife and children and ran. They left at night, on foot, carrying almost nothing. They begged for food along the way. Du Fu was ashamed of having to beg from strangers, but what else could he do? The mountain paths were empty. and all that he could hear were the calls of birds. His young daughter was so hungry that she bit him, and his first thought was to worry that the sound of her crying could carry through the mountains. He held her tight and covered her mouth. She struggled and cried harder. There was no way to quiet her, no way to explain. His son was a little older and tried to help in his own way. He said he wanted to eat the bitter berries growing along the path. He did not know that they could not be eaten. He just did not want to become a burden. For 10 days, they moved through the mountains, through rain and thunder. The path turned to mud, but they pulled each other along, step by step. Their clothes were soaked through and never dried. Finally, they reached Pengya and found an old friend named Sun Zai. It was already dark when they arrived, but Sun Zai lit the lamps and opened his doors. He heated water and cut paper charms to calm the children. Sun Zai's wife wept when she saw them and brought them fruit to eat. Sun Zai told Du Fu that no matter what happened, they were brothers. He cleared the room and told them to stay as long as they needed. In times like this, what kind of friend could still open their heart like this? After settling his family in a safe place, Du Fu heard that Crown Prince Li Hen had declared himself the new emperor of the Tang Dynasty and created a new court at Lingwu, far to the northwest. This was the emperor who would be known in history as Emperor Su Zong. Du Fu wanted to do what he could to help, so he left his family behind and set out for Lingwu. But he never reached it. Rebel forces captured him on the road and brought him to Chang'an, which was now under rebel occupation. It was September of 756. He was back in the capital, but things were different now than when he had last left it. One night, he looked up at the moon, and he thought of his wife. He knew his wife could see the moon too, but she must have been looking at it alone. The children were with her, but they were too young to understand. Too young to know why she would stand by the window at night, or what she was thinking about when she looked at the sky. He imagined her standing there long enough that the night mist had settled into her hair, that the cold of the moonlight had reached her arms. He did not know when this would end. He did not know when they would sit together again under the moon. In that moment, all he wanted was to be with her again, to let the moonlight dry both their tears at the same time, instead of each of them crying alone, separated by war. Du Fu was not the only one trapped in occupied Chang'an. When the emperor had fled the city, he had taken only a small group with him, his favorite consort, some officials, and his closest attendants. So many princes and princesses woke up the next day to find that the emperor was already gone when the rebels took the city. What followed was a massacre. The rebels hunted down the members of the imperial family that they could find, princes, princesses, their children. More than 100 were killed just in the first few days. One night, white ravens gathered above the gate the emperor had used to escape, crying in the dark. It was an omen. And it was then that Du Fu found one of the survivors at a street corner. The young man was crouched in the shadows at the edge of the road, in a place where almost no one would look. His clothes were in rags, his body marked by wounds from more than 100 days of hiding in bushes and abandoned places. But Du Fu saw the jade pendant at his waist, inlaid with coral, an ornament of the imperial family. And Du Fu stopped. When he asked who the young man was, he would not say. Instead, he said that he was suffering, that he was desperate, that he would even be willing to serve as a slave if anyone would take him in. He begged, "Please, let me survive." They could not stand there long because it was not safe to be seen talking near the main road. He told the young man what he had heard, that the rebels were everywhere, and they were looting the city, and that the imperial armies had collapsed. But a new emperor had taken the throne at Lingwu, and help was coming. "Do not lose hope," he said, "but do not repeat what I have told you, because the wrong ears might hear it. Stay alive, protect yourself, and wait for the return of the empire." And then he left, walking away and leaving the young prince in the shadows. where he was probably safer than anywhere else. It was November of 756. A Tang Dynasty chancellor named Fang Guan was given military command of the imperial forces and led the army to retake the capital. It was an army of new recruits from 10 prefectures of the northwest. Young men who had answered the empire's call to fight the rebellion. They met the rebel forces at Chen Tao Marsh, just northwest of Chang'an. But it was the rebel forces who returned to Chang'an with celebration. The fields of Chen Tao Marsh were silent, and 40,000 Tang Dynasty soldiers stayed in that marsh. Their blood soaked into the water until the water itself ran red. The rebel soldiers moved through the streets with song and dance, and they washed the blood from their weapons. The people of the city could not do anything except to watch. So the people of Chang'an turned away from them. They faced north, toward the direction of the new imperial court, and they wept. They watched the northern sky, holding on to the hope that the imperial armies still existed and still might come. Du Fu stood among them, a prisoner in the city, mourning an army he never saw. 2 days later, it happened again. Chancellor Fang Guan gathered his remaining forces and attempted to fight the rebel forces again at Qingban, to the west of Chen Tao Marsh. The Tang Dynasty soldiers were trying to hold their positions against the attack by the rebel forces, but they were freezing and outmatched. The rebel cavalry pushed forward, and it did not even take a full assault to break the lines of the imperial forces. Just a handful of rebel riders galloping forward with bows raised was enough to throw the imperial soldiers into panic and flight. A few rebel horsemen and thousands of imperial soldiers scattered. From a distance, across that frozen landscape, only two things stood out: the dark smoke of signal fires climbing into the sky, and on a white ground below, the bones of dead soldiers lay where they had fallen. Du Fu was still behind enemy lines, and he had no way of reaching the imperial commanders. But if he could have sent them a letter, he knew exactly what he would say. Do not rush. Endure and wait until spring. Do not act before you're ready. And then it was winter. One night, the clouds were low and the snow began to fall. It fell fast, swirling in the wind, and filled the dark sky. Du Fu sat alone and watched. There was no wine. His jug had been empty for a long time. The fire in his brazier had already died, but it still glowed red. He had no news from his family, no news from his brothers. The rebellion had cut off travel and letters across multiple provinces, and there was no way to know if the people he loved were alive or dead. He sat in the quiet of the falling snow and traced characters in the air with his finger. There was so much he wanted to say, but couldn't. And then it was spring, but it did not feel like spring. The mountains and rivers were still there. The grass was growing, and the trees were filling out. Nature continued as usual, with no interest in what had happened here. Du Fu looked at the flowers and felt worse. He heard the birds singing and felt a clench in his heart. What used to be simple pleasures were now a reminder of the tragedies of the world. Beacon fires had burned for 3 months without stopping, but there was still not a single letter from home. He did not know if his wife was safe, did not know if his children were alive. If only he could receive just one letter, he would have traded 10,000 gold for it. He reached up to scratch his head and felt how thin his hair had grown. It was white now, and so sparse that he could barely keep a pin in it. Du Fu made his escape from Chang'an during the spring and went north. The trees and grass had grown thick enough to hide a man on the back roads. Du Fu carefully made his way to Fengxiang, where the new Emperor Suzong had established a new court. He arrived wearing straw sandals and worn sleeves, and he went straight to see the emperor. The court took pity on him, and his close friends were shocked by how old and wretched he had become. The emperor granted him a position of left remonstrance official. It was a small position, of the 8th rank, but it was still an official position. In this period of chaos, Du Fu felt the grace of the emperor, and he was moved to tears. But he could not stop thinking about his family. He had not seen them since before his capture. 10 months earlier, he had sent a letter to Sanchuan where they were staying, but he never received a reply. He recently heard that the devastation of the rebellion had reached the area around where his family was, that entire towns had been wiped out, where not even the chickens or dogs had been spared. How many could have survived something like that? And even if a few had lived, how could an entire family have made it through together? Now he was afraid of receiving a reply. Maybe no news was good news. Maybe it was better to not know. What if, at the end of it all, he was the only one alive to see it? Instead, he turned to wine. It was autumn of 757. It was the second year of the reign of the new emperor. It was a time of peril and hardship, and not a single person in the empire could afford a single day of rest. The emperor and his court were doing their best, but the rebellion was still not over, and Du Fu couldn't help but worry that something important could be overlooked. But he was overwhelmed by worry for his family and asked for a leave, which was granted to his surprise and shame. And so he left Fengxiang with a heavy heart. He needed to travel north to where his family was supposed to be. And as the road carried him away, he kept looking back. He couldn't help but wonder, when would the chaos end? He passed through untended fields and overgrown paths. Many of the people he encountered were wounded, still in pain, still bleeding from their injuries. He couldn't help them, so he kept going. He climbed into the mountains. The terrain turned steep, and the air grew cold. Along the way, he passed by shallow watering holes, where soldiers must have stopped to rest their horses. He saw giant rocks shaped like fierce tigers, cliffs that rose around him. The wild fruits he saw were small and scattered, some red, some black, some sweet, some bitter, and yet they grew side by side. It was so calm and peaceful here. If only he could stay here forever and forget about the outside world. But he kept going, and one night he walked through an old battlefield. The moon was cold and clear, and he saw the remains of the men who had fallen there. He thought about how the great imperial army lost so quickly at the disastrous battle of Tongguan. The army had hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Why did the army lose so quickly? Their defeat doomed more than half of the people in the region to become ghosts. How many families had lost someone there without even knowing what happened? He kept walking, and by the time he finally reached home with his white hair, he hadn't seen his family for over a year. He heard his wife before he saw her, and when she saw him, she broke into tears. Not from sadness, but from the shock of seeing him alive. The sound of her cries seemed to echo in the pine trees, and a nearby spring sounded as if it was weeping with her. Then he looked at his children. His son's feet were bare, his body unwashed, his clothes in rags. His two little daughters stood in dresses covered in patches, the hems far too short, barely reaching their knees. But at least they were all alive. Overwhelmed by fatigue and relief, Du Fu collapsed. He showed the little gifts that he had brought them, but he was angry at himself for not bringing more clothes and silk, something to keep them warm from the cold of the world. Du Fu watched his wife and children and felt something loosen in his chest. The children climbed on him, pulled at his beard, and asked him questions all at once. But even now, he couldn't stop thinking about the war. The emperor was still living in exile, and the fighting was not over. How many more days before the soldiers could rest? He looked at the sky and thought he could see something changing, maybe a darkness clearing. The Huihe from the northern steppes had agreed to send soldiers and cavalry to help the imperial forces. There would be a cost to their assistance, but with their help, Luoyang and Chang'an would definitely be reclaimed. The treacherous minister Yang Guozhong and his corrupt officials had been executed, and the tide of disaster had turned. Du Fu believed that the rebellion was coming to an end. Would the empire that he had served his entire life hold together long enough to make it through? He looked at his children and knew that it would. He had made it home, but home was not what it used to be. The neighbors heard and came. They didn't say much. They just looked. And some of them wept quietly, thinking about their own losses, their own missing people. That night, Du Fu and his wife sat across from each other with a candle between them. To find each other alive felt like a dream, and they were both afraid that speaking would break the spell. The days that followed were quieter, but not easier. Du Fu knew he should be grateful. He was alive. His family was alive. The harvest had come in, and there would be enough to eat. Soon, there would even be new wine to drink. But he thought about the world around him and the horrors that he had seen over the past year. He tried to help the empire, but he felt that his contributions were small. He couldn't help but feel that he did not deserve this peace. But he didn't know what else to do. So he turned back to his wine to numb his mind. One afternoon, 4 or 5 of the village elders came to visit Du Fu to welcome him home. They even brought gifts and more wine. But they apologized for the quality of it, explaining that the fields had mostly gone unplanted. All of the young men had gone east to fight the war, and there was no one left to work land. Du Fu looked at these old men and felt something that he couldn't describe. He told them that in these times of hardship, I am ashamed to receive your kindness. Then he sighed and looked up at the sky, and everyone in the room cried. Du Fu did not remain in Qiang village for long. The rebellion did not end as quickly as he thought it would. So he returned to the imperial court of Emperor Suzong because he still wanted to try to make a difference. But unfortunately, it didn't work out for him. When Chancellor Fang Guan was attacked at court for his military losses, Du Fu respected his integrity and loyalty and tried to defend him. The emperor was not happy with Du Fu's words and eventually demoted him to a minor post in Huazhou. And during his time at Huazhou, Du Fu witnessed crop failures, inflation, heavy taxes, and growing hardship. And then it was spring of 759. Chang'an and Luoyang had been recaptured by imperial forces already, and it seemed that the rebellion was finally coming to an end. But then came the battle at Yechen, where the imperial army completely collapsed against the forces of the rebellion, and over 100,000 soldiers were lost. And suddenly, the empire was in urgent need of more soldiers, and a new wave of conscription began. One day, while on official business, Du Fu passed through the town of Xin'an, and he heard a commotion. There was shouting in the street. A crowd had gathered. Officials were calling names, one by one, and the people they named were pulled out and lined up. But Du Fu looked at the line and knew something was wrong. These were not men. They were just boys. Some of them were so small that he didn't think that they would even be able to wear armor. He called out to the official in charge, "Is this region so small that there are no grown men?" The official replied, "The orders just came down last night. We need to conscript these boys now." And Du Fu said, "But these boys are so short and small. How can they possibly defend the capital?" But Du Fu did not have the power to stop the conscription. He looked again at the line. The healthier boys were accompanied by their mothers, while the thinner and smaller boys stood alone. Nearby, the river flowed silently, and the mountains seemed to echo with the sounds of weeping. Du Fu turned to the crying families and tried to comfort them. He told them not to cry, that the commanders at the front were good men, that their sons would be looked after, and that the conditions were not as terrible as they imagined. He said that the imperial army fought for a righteous cause and that there was no need to cry. He wasn't sure that he believed what he said. But what else could he possibly say to a mother watching her son leave for war? That night, Du Fu stopped at a village called Shihao. He needed a place to stay and found lodging with an old couple who lived there. In the middle of the night, he heard pounding on the door. Loud, urgent pounding. It was officials, coming around to conscript more soldiers. The old man climbed over the back wall and disappeared. He heard the officials shouting. They were aggressive. And he heard the old woman respond with tears and grief. He heard her talk about her 3 sons. My 3 sons have already been sent to fight in the battle at Yechen. I just heard that 2 of them are already dead. My 3rd son might still be alive, but I don't know. There is no one left in this house, just my grandson, who is still an infant, and his mother, who could not even leave the house because she doesn't have a whole dress to wear. And then he heard her voice change. I am old, and I have no strength left, but I can go with you. I cannot hold a weapon, and I cannot fight, but I can make food for the soldiers. And then the voices faded. But a faint sound of crying continued through the night. When dawn came, Du Fu continued on his way, and there was only the old man there to say goodbye. The next stop on the road was Tongguan Pass. When Du Fu arrived, he saw how worn and exhausted the soldiers looked. The soldiers were hauling stone, moving earth, and building walls. He called out to the official in charge. Are you rebuilding this pass to defend against the rebels? The official invited Du Fu to walk with him and showed him around. He pointed at a craggy bend in the mountains. Do you see how high we have built the barricades? Even a flying bird would not be able to pass them. If the rebels come again, all we would need to do is to defend, and they would never be able to get past. Then he pointed downwards. Look at the narrow pass, where only a single carriage can pass at a time. If there was a battle here, a single man could defend it. The official's words were filled with confidence and determination, but Du Fu couldn't help but think of painful memories about how the imperial army was completely defeated here just 3 years ago. In that battle, the defending general had also said that he could easily defend the pass. But unfortunately, corrupt officials forced the imperial army to leave the safety of the pass to attack the rebel forces directly, leading to disaster, and the imperial forces were destroyed. So Du Fu told the official, please, I beg you, tell the general in charge here, remember what you just told me and defend. Do not leave the pass. Do not repeat the same mistake of the past. To marry a daughter to a soldier who is going to war is worse than casting her out by the side of the road. Not everyone Du Fu saw on the road was being taken to war. Some were being left behind. She had been married the night before, and at dawn, her new husband was leaving for war. Their bed had not even been warmed by their bodies, and they had not even finished the wedding properly. By custom, a new bride had to formally bow before her husband's parents and pay respect to the ancestors. But none of that had happened. There had been one night, and now he was leaving. She had grown up being told that marriage meant security, a household, a future. Her parents had kept her sheltered and close until they found the right match. But now he was going to war, and what was she to do? She thought about going with him, but she couldn't. A woman at the front would only be a burden. So she told him, don't worry about our marriage. Focus on your duty and fight well for the kingdom. Then she took off her jewelry. She put away her nice clothes, and she washed off her makeup. She would never dress up again until he came back. she said. Look at all of the birds in the sky, flying free. No matter their size, they fly in pairs. Life does not always go the way that we want it, but my heart will always be with you, forever. And she did not cry. Further down the road, Du Fu witnessed another farewell. He saw an old man. The old man's son and grandsons had all died in the war, and now the officials had come for him. He was old and he walked with a stick, but when the conscription order came, he put his stick down and got ready. His sons might be dead, but the empire was still at war, and he was still breathing. If the empire needed him, he would go. He put on his armor, and then he went to say goodbye to his wife. She was standing by the road in a coat that was tattered and thin. She cried. He held her close to comfort her against the bitter cold, and he heard her say, "Please, do not forget to eat your food." He knew that this was the last time they would see each other, and he knew that he would never return home. But he told her, the fortifications at Tumen Pass are strong, and it would be difficult for the enemy. The situation is different now than before. Even if soldiers die, it would not be soon. Maybe I will be home soon. He knew she did not believe it. She knew he did not believe it either. He lingered and sighed. The world was still at war, and every region was suffering from conscription. The trees and grass were filled with corpses, and the rivers and plains were stained red with blood. When the world was at war, nowhere was safe. What would happen to his wife, all by herself? His heart was filled with pain, but he could not afford to hesitate. He did not look back as he walked away, but his face was covered in tears. But what if a soldier had no one left to even say farewell to? Du Fu came across another man who was conscripted for war. But this man was a soldier who had actually just returned home after surviving the devastation of the battle at Yechen. The young soldier had walked a long way to get back to his village. It was a village that once held over 100 households. But now the paths were overgrown, and it was too quiet. The village was empty. He moved through it slowly. He walked through the empty alleys. And then he heard something and rushed towards it. But all he found were wild foxes and badgers. Eventually, he found 2 old ladies still in their homes because they had nowhere else to go. He asked them, where was everyone? Where did everybody go? And they told him that everyone was gone. Some had fled, but they didn't know where. The others who stayed in the village had died. His own mother was ill even before he had gone to war and had passed away shortly after he left. He was not there for her when she needed him the most, and he could not even bury her to honor her now. He picked up a hoe and began to tend to the fields around him. It was still his home, after all. But then the conscription orders came again. He had just returned, but it was time to go again. He looked around and saw that there was nothing to bring with him, and there was no one for him to say farewell to. He thought, if a man did not even have a home to return to, then what was the point? Du Fu never forgot the people he had met on his travels. He saw ordinary people pay the price for a war they did not choose, and he realized that he would never be able to make a difference as an official. He resigned from his government position and spent the next few years moving around the empire with his family, trying to find somewhere where they could survive, doing what he could to keep them alive. And then it was spring of 763. Du Fu was in Zizhou with his family when he heard the news. Shi Chaoyi, the last leader of the rebellion, had been defeated. After 8 long years, the rebellion was finally over. Du Fu burst into tears. They were tears of joy. He turned around to look at his wife and children. The worry and sorrow that had plagued them for so long were gone. They were smiling. He began to pack up his scrolls and books. He wanted to sing. He wanted to drink. It was a new beginning with the bright green of spring to guide them. It was time to go home. Du Fu lived to see the rebellion end, but he never made it home. His health deteriorated on his way to Luoyang, and he had to repeatedly stop on the way, eventually passing away on a boat on the Sheng River in the year 770, still hundreds of miles away. He was 58 years old. He never achieved the career that he dreamed of, but he left behind his poems. And through his poems, we saw stories that the official histories would never tell us. The official histories remembered An Lushan, they remember the emperors, and they remember the generals. But Du Fu's poems remembered everyone else. Because if no one wrote them down, did their suffering matter? That's it for today's video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Stay curious, stay magical.